for being here. So for a short introduction, the Open Diplomacy Institute, with the official support of the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs, created the G8 and G20 youth summits under the high patronage of President Sarkozy at the time, during the 2011 French G20 and G8 presidency. And since then, we recruit, train, and finance the Youth 20 and Youth 7 delegates for France with the support of the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And so this year, the French delegates won't only attend the Youth 7 and Youth 20 summits, but also the high-level political forum and the ECOSOC forum in the framework of the UN. And today, we are pleased to talk about the following theme of the conference, which is From an Emergency to Another, is the UN up to speed? A critical assessment of the boosting role of G summits. And indeed, the world is facing many crises at the same time. COVID crisis, the climate crisis, rising inequalities, rising tensions in a more and more polarized world. And a crisis, by definition, is a phenomenon that requires urgent actions and urgent decisions. And these crises in particular are inherently require collective action and cooperation at international level. And this raises the question of the diplomatic fora that are able to manage these crises. So the UN, on the one hand, is a well-established international institution that gathers all countries in the world, whereas G7 and G20 summits are informal groups of leading countries deciding on their own to meet and discuss about the main international issues of the moment. And this leads to different assets and effects of the UN versus G summits. And this is actually what we are going to talk about today. So thank you for having accepted our invitation. And I'm glad to introduce our panelists. So Thomas FRIANG, he's founder and CEO of the Open Diplomacy Institute. Dr. Ella KOKOTSIS, Director for Research and Accountability of the G20 Research Group at the University of Toronto within the Munk School of Global Affairs. Cyrille Pierre, Assistant Director General for Global Affairs at the French Ministry for European and Foreign Affairs. Thank you. And Jean-Pierre TARDIEU, President Emeritus of the Veolia Institute, member of the Executive Committee of the French Association for the United Nations. And Manish could not be here, unfortunately. He is member of the Indian Parliament. Not sure if he's going to join. Thank you all for being here. And before we start the discussion, I let the floor to Jean-Baptiste Boissou, who is head of delegation of the French delegation of the Youth 20 and ECOSOC Forum. And he will say a few words about the selection process at the end of this conference. Please, Jean-Baptiste.
Thank you, Mathilde. Good evening, everybody, and good morning for those who are on the American side. Just a few words about the process. So thank you for all your propositions that you introduced and you published during the last days on LinkedIn, and that those propositions were quite rich, and then we pre-selected some of you. So basically, you will receive an email at the end of this conference. So at 7:30 for those who are in France with the results. And so for those who received this email, we will be happy to have you for future interviews this weekend on Saturday to go in the next step of the selection process. And in any case, we were very happy and very pleased with all your propositions. So thank you all for this participation and congratulations.
Thank you, Jean-Baptiste. So maybe you can start the discussion with the first question for Cyrille Pierre, I think. From your experience and coming back on the historical foundation of each diplomatic forum, what kind of differences and distribution of roles and functions do you observe between the UN, G7 and G20 summits?
Yes, thank you very much. It's And thank you for this opportunity to discuss all together to prepare the next steps for G7 and G20. Your question is quite wide and quite tricky, but to try to summarize, when you look at the international system, you have clearly 3 types of organizations, and I would even say 4 types of organizations. As you mentioned, the UN relies on the notion of universality and also equality between all its members. That means one state, one vote. So that's one model, which is extremely inclusive, which is necessary, where a very small state has the power as much as the US or China or whatever. On the other hand, you have the Bretton Woods institutions like the World Bank and also the IMF and also regional development banks, where I would say you have some kind of organizations where you have $1 and you have 1 vote. That means that the kind of capital you have in these organizations, these banks, gives you the power to decide. So that's a different model, which is not equal, and where clearly some countries have the majority of votes and power because they own the majority of the capital. The third model is the club-based organizations like the G7 and G20. And I would say that they are a mix of the 2 former models, because officially all member states which belong to the G7 and G20 have an equal vote. I mean, it's a kind of consensus that you have to reach within these clubs. And at the same time, clearly, it's clear that these clubs are closely linked to the notion of power, to the notion of efficiency regarding their weight in ODA, their weight in terms of GDP, their weight in terms of what they can do in the fight against climate change, etc. So it's a mixture between the 2 former models. And I wouldn't say that there is a clear cut, a clear division of roles between the UN, the G7 and the G20. Clearly, it was not thought in that way at the beginning. I think that the problem of the UN, we all know it, is that it is extremely inclusive and universal, but that there is sometimes a lack of efficiency when you want to decide on very urgent matters. And so the G7 and G20, they are clearly here to have less member states, of course, 8 in the G7, if you add with the European Commission or the EU. The G20, it's in reality more than 20 countries, because you have many other countries which are invited regularly to the summits. But I think that the key importance of G7 and G20 is precisely to be quite small clubs, but at the same time, quite representative of the reality of power. And so they shouldn't act as a substitute to the UN. Clearly, it's not their role, but they are there really to try to trigger the international system, to give some political guidance to a heavy international system, which they don't replace it, but they have a key role to play to give at the right time the political guidance these organizations need. So we'll stop there, not to be too long at that stage.
Thank you very much. And as you are actually working on this at the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs, could you tell us as an introduction to about the main political priorities of the G7 German presidency this year and G20 Indonesian presidency?
Yes, it's a little bit too early to say at the moment, because we had, regarding the G7 German presidency, the first Sherpa meeting was held only at the beginning of this week. So it's quite early. As you know, in Germany, there was a change of government. So it's probably too early. But what I can say at the moment is that energy transition and the fight against climate change will be key issues in the context of the idea from the German presidency to have a climate club that would really gather or pull together the main actors. We know also that the last COP in Glasgow regarding climate change was a mixed success, I would say, or mixed failure. That the critical time to act regarding climate change is from now until 2030. Afterwards, it will be too late. So clearly, with the new German government, we feel a strong interest in this notion of organizing the energy transition and putting around the G7 other actors in a kind of club because, as you know, regarding climate change, we have this old notion of countries which have to finance the rest of the world, which are in the part 1 of the Kyoto Convention in its first section, and the rest of the world. And now we are in a world where we all know that if countries like China, India, Indonesia, South Africa, and others do not share the collective efforts and the objectives, it will be very difficult for the G7 to act alone. So that will be on the G7 side. From the G20 side, I think that, again, it's quite early to say, but there are some interesting points in the fact that Indonesia is chairing the G20 for the first time in history. So it's very interesting in itself, of course, but the main priorities will be probably directed to the management of health challenges and risk. We are still living in a world where COVID-19 has not disappeared. That's the less we can say. Clearly, also, we will discuss probably about macroeconomic balances. You know that one of the key issues right now is inflation in the world and the way where central banks will interact with each other. And so it's clearly this macroeconomic balance of the world will be certainly key. Also, digital issues, where we see a clear interest to have together all the new giants of the tech and artificial intelligence. It's not only an American issue, but it's more and more a Chinese, Japanese, Indian, and German issue, and for France, of course. And also, the last one will be environmental issues, since we will have the COP15 on biodiversity, which is expected to take place in China. So after Glasgow, we will have the Kunming conference. And we are also very interested in the way Indonesia leads its policies regarding the coal emissions, and the fact that Indonesia is among emerging countries which has a very clear opinion about the way it should reform its energetic mix, including coal. And so that's an interesting thing to be signaled.
Thank you very much, Cyrille. We are glad to welcome Manish TEWARI. Thank you very much for being here. So honorable member of the Indian Parliament and former Union Minister and 2021 Parliamentarian for Peace. Thank you very much, Manish. Just for the organization, I would like to tell the audience that we'll take the 30 last minutes for a Q&A session. To continue the discussion, KOKOTSIS, how are the G7, G20 and UN's priorities and efforts shaped in terms of content and process? Can you?
Thanks, Mathilde, and many thanks for the invitation to you and to Thomas and to the Open Diplomacy Institute for having the ability to participate in today's panel session. I really appreciate it. So the host country assumes the G7 and the G20 presidency on January 1st of every calendar year, and that country then establishes the priorities for its summit. So for Germany, we know they've identified, as we just heard, climate change is going to be key, the environment, biodiversity, the global energy transition, sustainable and fair global economy. These have been identified as key priorities. But how do they come to establish this list? In some cases, it's really a reflection of the host country's priorities. Climate change has always been front and center and very important to the Germans, so it continues as a priority theme this year. When Canada last hosted its G7 summit in Charlevoix in 2018, Justin Trudeau made gender equity, women's empowerment, for example, in oceans plastics, the key pillars of his summit. So those are, some of the key drivers. But agenda setting, I would argue, is also very much a reflection of the host country's leader themselves. For example, under former German Chancellor Angela Merkel in 2015, when Germany last hosted in Schloss Elmau, the G7 agreed to phase out fossil fuels by the end of the century. And in so doing, they paved the way for what I would argue was a fairly successful COP meeting several months later, where the countries adopted the Paris Agreement. I'd also say that global shocks are very important compellers in terms of G7 and G20 agenda setting. These leaders are expected to perform more quickly and more strongly to shocks and certain vulnerabilities within their own countries and those of their G7 or G20 partners. And we see this particularly the case in terms of their accelerated response to the global pandemic and the rollout of vaccines and financial disbursements. And I'd also say that active dialogue and cooperation between the G7 and the G20 with other countries, other communities, private enterprises, other international organizations, and also, of course, civil society, they're also reflected in the ways the agendas are shaped, both in terms of content and in terms of process. Again, we've seen this with the Germans this year. The Germans have already outlined their agenda and their schedule for this year, which includes a commitment to a series of engagements with non-state actors, including the Business 7 community, the Civil 7, Labor 7, the Think 7, Women's 7, and of course the Youth 7. So within these forums, there are common positions on G7 agenda issues that are developed and proposed, which in turn feed into the host country's list of key themes and priorities. And this process effectively repeats itself on an annual basis. It applies to both the G7 and the G20, to some extent the BRICS as well. But I will leave it to the UN experts on the panel to speak to how the UN's priorities are shaped.
Thank you very much, Ella. Maybe Jean-Pierre, you would like to react and maybe to tell us a bit about the main assets and main defects that you see in G summits on the one hand and on the UN on the other, and tell us how the decision-making process is done within the UN and the priorities for the UN this year.
Yes, with pleasure. Okay, I think that Mr. Cyrille Pierre has very well shaped and presented the role of the different actors during his presentation. What I want to insist on a little is that, historically speaking, I think that the G7 as well as G20 have been more oriented towards the economic and financial issues, but progressively have extended their viewpoint to also to environmental affairs, for example. On the contrary, the UN have taken a lot of initiatives, including, for example, the Rio Summit in '92 and following summits, created the basis to tackle the environmental global issues as climate, biodiversity, desertification, etc. And not only organize that in administrative terms, but also have created tools, scientific tools, I mean, with, for example, the IP, the GIEC, what we call it in France, for climate, and the IPBES for biodiversity, etc., that have given a real possibility to convince the people who were, when starting, were very skeptical about these questions, either because of the absence of knowledge or because of some interest, of course. But we have really progressed because, and thanks to this scientific basis. So a very positive point for the UN. Of course, the difficulty for the UN conferences, as Mr. Pierre said, is this rule of unanimity, which is very difficult to respect, and that in general, even when we have some satisfactory conclusion, as for example for the Paris Agreement in after the COP21 in 2015, even in these circumstances, the agreement is always a compromise. For example, the Paris Agreement, because of the United States in particular, have not decided for really constraints, the really thing that will engage the different states. It was more the idea to create a dynamic, a momentum to continue going on, progressing on this question, critical question of climate. But that is a difficulty. Today, to be short, today, I think that after, for example, the Glasgow conference, we have had a balanced result, yes, but the difficulty is to obtain that the member states really get involved in the application, in the implementation of what was more or less decided. And for this, the coalition, the alliances, involving member states, but also NGOs, business sometimes, and different other participants, or just a limited number of member states, for example, can be and must be a real tool to progress. And I think, and regarding this point, the G7 and G20 can play a role to pave the way for such a thing.
Yes, thank you very much. And we are going to come back on the point of implementation indeed, and follow-up of engagements. Maybe Manish TEWARI, you would like to react on the assets and defects of G20, G7 versus the UN. Would you like to react on that?
Well, thank you very much. I'm sorry that I joined in late because there was a connection issue. Zoom was misbehaving for some strange reason. Be that as it may, it's been extremely enlightening to listen to the views of some of my fellow panelists. What you've asked is a very complex question. It's almost like enigma rolled into a mystery. If you try and juxtapose the United Nations against the G7 and the G20. I think fundamentally they are extremely different kettle of fish because they've been created at different points in time in history. The United Nations at its core, especially the Security Council, reflects the post-World War II order. So therefore, it's almost frozen in time in terms of what it really represents, especially with regard to its veto power. The G7, of course, is a more current creation, 1995, if I remember correctly. essentially a representative organization of some of the most developed liberal democracies in the world. And the G20, I think, was an attempt to really correct the aberration which the United Nations represents in the last part of the 20th century, or now in the second decade of or the third decade of the second decade of the 21st century, which is try and bring more people or more nations into the international system and give it some kind of equitable representation. So therefore, essentially, the question really is not what do you do with the United Nations, but what do you do without the United Nations? So therefore, with all its flaws and all the calls for reform, which unfortunately have not gone anywhere over the past 3 decades, the United Nations still continues to remain an effective or an important trans-governmental forum or intergovernmental forum. And both the G7 and the G20 can actually play a complementary role in trying to hasten and speeden up the process of reforms in the United Nations, which has been now hanging fire for a very, very long time. And the post-World War II status quo needs to really give way to a new world order. I think the biggest failing of the United Nations system was essentially its inability to come up with a global response to the COVID-19 pandemic. In fact, when the pandemic broke out in the January of 2020, it was only in April, if I recall correctly, for the first time, under a Dominican presidency, that the United Nations Security Council actually had a discussion on the entire COVID-19 pandemic. And in fact, both the G7 and the G20 have also come up short, because while there have been certain efforts at global cooperation and coordination, most responses to COVID-19 have not even been national responses. They've actually been very subnational responses, almost community level or city level responses. And everybody has tried to innovate and craft their own strategy to deal with this pandemic, which still continues. And I think that in itself is a trigger to really rethink the global order in the wake of what the world has seen over the past 20 odd months. Coupled with that, I think the United Nations and both, of course, the G20 and the G7 especially have a challenge staring themselves in the face in the form of what's really happening between Russia and Ukraine. And the whole world would watch that very carefully as to how these organizations, if at all they are able to play a role, can provide a modus vivendi which can lead to a peaceful resolution of what appears to be an extremely tense situation at this point in time. So I think there is a lot of work which needs to be done in terms of remodeling, refurbishing the United Nations. In fact, one of the organs which requires immediate attention is the World Health Organization, because if you were to rewind back to the initial days of COVID-19, the responses which came out of the World Health Organization were extremely subliminal, to put it very, very mildly. And it almost seemed as if there was an attempt to play down the extent and the magnitude of the pandemic, especially between the January of 2020 almost all the way to the March of 2020. So therefore, I would stop there and respond to any questions you may have.
Thank you very much. And yes, indeed, we are going to come back on the issue of how to include civil society in these international organizations and fora, I would say. Thank you for this. Maybe Ella and Thomas, you would like to react on the question of, in the ecosystem of international institutions, what sets the G7 and G20 apart, in particular in their ability to manage global crises?
Yeah, thank you, Mathilde. It's a great question, and I think it piggybacks on what we've just heard from the other panelists, and I would agree with Manish's assessment of reform possibilities within the UN context in that regard. But I would argue that the G7 and the G20's collective predominance on a number of levels makes them more likely to effectively manage global crises. The G7 shares a common set of norms and values that are grounded, and this goes back to their inception in 1975, in democracy, equality, the rule of law, respect for human rights. And on the basis of those shared values, the G7 are often able to adopt a clear and a unified position with respect to international crises. Now, the G20, on the other hand, account for 80% of global economic output, 75% of global exports, 60% of the world's population. So there are those who would argue that the G20 is in fact more representative of the current international balance of power and is therefore more suited to responding to these global crises. And two notable examples I would raise. The first was in 2008 during the global financial crisis. It was the G20 that came together for the first time at the leaders level. So from 1999, it was the foreign and finance ministers, predominantly the finance ministers and World Bank leaders who were meeting at that level to deal with G20 financial issues, but it was really the 2008 financial crisis that prompted the leaders to get together for the first time and to implement historic and far-reaching reforms to the international financial system. And the meeting at the leaders level, I would argue, was fairly successful in doing so, and they've agreed to meet every year since. And secondly, I would take a different position on the COVID response over the past 2 years. It was the G7 that came together under emergency circumstances. It was the first time they've done so in March of 2020. So prior to the UN Security Council meeting to deal with COVID. And again, they met in February 2021 and collectively committed over $8.5 billion in financing the procurement and the direct dose sharing of vaccines globally. In addition, the G7 was also able to advance COVID economic recovery plans that totaled over 12 trillion in fiscal support, both for their own countries and their own businesses, but as well as for developing countries and emerging economies. These efforts were hailed by both the WHO and COVAX as historic and landmark agreements that showed that these summit institutions do have strong political alignment and collaboration and can work together to get things done fairly quickly in times of crisis. So I'd argue that the UN's larger, more diverse composition may in some cases lead to a lack of coordination and consensus among members, or even specific blocs or bodies that are dedicated to certain crisis issues, which can then lead to a sense of fragmentation or delays in effective response mechanisms. And I'll just cite one quick example. In 2009 with the Copenhagen Accord, which I think the response became increasingly inadequate to meet the global need. And in turn, that allowed the G7 to some extent fill that governance gap through their commitment to raise $100 billion in annual climate financing from both public and private sources. And this then allowed the Green Climate Fund, for example, to become more fully operational in 2015. So certainly both sets of institutions have their pros and cons, but I'd have to argue that the GX summits have shown over time that they can be quite effective in terms of their global crisis response mechanisms. And I'll leave it to my UN colleagues to respond to that. Thank you, Mathilde.
Thank you very much. Going to the question of implementation and effective, do you think maybe Thomas and Cyrille Pierre, is there a robust process in place between the G7, G20 and the UN for ensuring accountability and compliance from one summit to another? And are there other institutions playing a role in this effective implementation of agreements? Maybe Thomas first and Cyrille just afterwards.
It's a question that shed lights on the major differences that we have between the UN systems and GX endeavors. As we've been laying out very clearly, there are two different types of groups. I use the word groups because formally G20 and G7 are not international organizations. They are only clubs. And this major difference stems from the fact that there is no voting process. There's only a consensus process. The agenda is set by the presidency's interests mostly and leaders' interests. And there is certainly what makes the most difference. There is no secretariat. That's the difference between a formal group, a formal organization, which has a secretariat, an assembly, and maybe a council. If there is a difference between a council and the assembly, that's what the UN looks like. And in the case of the GX system, there is no formality and there is certainly no secretariat. That's what has been critical to make sure that GX summits have a relevance in international systems, on top of what Manish has clearly said regarding the better reflection of the balance of power in the 21st century. There is also this notion of very strong reactivity to crisis, and on top of representativity, and this reactivity stems from the absence of procedures. There are no rules. There are only habits, like the Sherpa meetings, which set the agenda and prepare the leaders meeting, ministerial meetings. But this difference is key. And that brings me to answering very specifically the question of accountability. Due to this major difference, accountability is very different from a G20 or G7 type of organization and the UN systems. There is one thing in common, is that since 2011, I would say, the G20 and G8 groups have engagement groups, as we call them, the Youth 20, the B20, the Labor 20, to reach out to different civil society streams, which do ask for accountability from a year to another. Just like in the UN, there is the notion of major groups, which do represent different constituencies of the civil society around the UN different bodies, and mostly the ECOSOC body that we have not mentioned so far. But accountability is very different. Despite this similarity, accountability is working differently because of the absence of secretariat. Because on the G20, G7 side, implementation does not rely on a established ongoing organization. That there has been many debates about this. Should there be a secretariat behind the G7 and the G20? And the answer has become clearly no so far, despite the fact that the OECD makes a major role for the G20, for the G20. And here I come to conclude on this question. Secretariat makes a lot of difference in preparing the decision of leaders, both at, for example, the UN Secretary Council and the G20 summit, because the Secretariat plays a role in the UN to shape under the presidency, the rotating presidency, to shape the decisions and to gather data and list what has been done and present every result. In the G20, G7 format, accountability works differently in the context that you have no secretariat. That's because the accountability works between peers. It's different nations looking at each other and saying, well, we've agreed on this. This is our plan of action. Where do you peers stand each other on implementation of what we have decided? It's a kind of peer reviewing process that processes very differently. Though the fact that the OECD has played an increasing role in helping the G20 nations to get into the details, there are many working groups and ministerial meetings to shape the G20 leaders' decisions. And on top of that, they also task and set the agenda of many international organizations. But there is no secretariat, and the OECD here is helping a lot in, I would say, get into more technical discussions. And if I could take one example, if we look at the Rome decision, the decision of the Rome summit that happened this summer about fiscal taxation, global taxation, and minimal taxation, it's at the OECD level that there will be technical further progress to make sure that this is implementable at the global scale. And this is very interesting to show how G summits interact with other international bodies, which are formal organizations. They set the agenda, they guide structures to steer into the right direction where there could be consensus. It's a political agreement forging body, and then they revert back at technical organizations to set standards and to get into the details of global governance. And that would have been useful in having the G20 and G7 groups, in boosting not only the OECD, the UN system, but many different organizations, including the one that Cyrille Pierre has mentioned in his introduction, the Bretton Woods organizations, which have been very helpful in dealing with the crisis that the G20 had to cope with. I would like to state in conclusion that the G20 has always been seen and has been living as a G20, as a economic crisis management room. It was born in the late 90s to deal with the Asian financial crisis and monetary crisis at the ministry level and central bankers level. And it got to the leaders level, the heads of state and government level, during the subprime crisis in 2008. And that means that it's mostly the difference that exists in accountability is mostly in providing efficient response to crisis, which is a very different accountability approach than the UN system.
Thank you, Thomas. Maybe Cyrille, you want to add something shortly?
Yes, thank you very much. Very shortly, because I share most of what Thomas has just said. Just to say in very simple words, but on the one hand, at the UN, you have a secretariat in international organizations, but I would say no leaders altogether. It's very rare. You don't have in the same room all the leaders, even at the UN General Assembly, where they come the one after the other. So on the one hand, a secretariat and continuity, but no leaders altogether. And on the other hand, you have leaders, but no secretariat. So that's the issue. But having said that, I think that there's one organization which plays a specific role, as Thomas has mentioned, regarding the G7 and G20. It is the OECD. It's a paradox since at least 1/3 of the G20 members are not members of the OECD. But the OECD has this technical and objective role to put some figures on the table, to put some data which are reliable, which are comparable. And so the OECD, just to give you two examples, it has a key role to play regarding a kind of shadow secretariat of these clubs. Let me take the example of taxation, where clearly since the G20 was established, the OECD had a leading role on the issue of tax havens in 2028, 29. And now, if you see the issue of taxation of the digital economy, you see the kind of relationship between the OECD, G7, G20. Another example I have in mind is climate finance, which is also a key objective with the famous target of the $100 billion to reach in 2020. Who is the judge for the achievement of this pathway to the $100 billion? It's the OECD, with the measurement of the so-called climate finance. It's the OECD report, which is discussed at the G20 and the G7. So I think there's a specific role for the OECD. Regarding the IMF and the World Bank, if you see most of the initiatives of the G7 and G20 regarding debt relief in the 1980s, 1990s, once the G7 has reached an agreement within its members, it was very easy to implement this agreement on debt relief through the IMF, the Paris Club, etc. And it's the same, I think, for the World Bank and the way it interacts with the G20, for the simple reason that the majority of the capital of the Bretton Woods institutions is owned by G20 and G7 members. So the link here is quite clear because of the specificity of these banks. It's probably more difficult with UN organizations, where the link is not that easy, but clearly I think the UN plays a critical role in sending to the G20 and G7, I would say, a kind of science-based approach, because when the leaders have to discuss about critical issues, like where are we on climate change, where are we on the energy mix, at the end, they will rely on the IPCC reports, on the International Energy Agency, etc., etc. So when you look at the end, who brings the data and material on the table to discuss? It's the UN organizations. So we'll stop there, but just to give a few examples.
Thank you so much, Cyrille. Maybe two questions left before we start the Q&A session. Questioning the legitimacy of G20, G7 summits. How relevant are these rooms of discussion when international crises largely overtake 7 or 20 powers? And what role can civil society play to give them more legitimacy and more voice? Maybe Manish, you would like to react on that?
No, thank you very much. I think both the G7 and the G20 do have a very, very important role to play, as it was being outlined by one of the panelists, that it represents not only in terms of demographics, but in terms of output, in terms of exports, possibly the largest volumes which are going around the world. So therefore, in terms of economic heft and political heft, the G7 and the G20 do definitely represent, as Thomas was putting it, the current balance of power. So I do not see that there is really an adversarial relationship. And given the challenges that we face, especially the challenge of climate change, where there is and will continue to be a lot of divergence, if not dissonance, between the positions of the developed world and the developing world, the G20 at least provides a platform to be able to better harmonize these positions as we get into the implementation phase after Glasgow. So under those circumstances, these meetings, and especially because they are apex level meetings, heads of governments meetings, do provide an opportunity to arrive at a modus vivendi, if not a consensus, on some of these critical issues. But I do take that point that there is a need to institutionalize at least the G20 by bringing in other stakeholders onto the table and seeing as to whether certain concurrent platforms can be spun off, where there could be a greater involvement of different institutions across different countries. For example, even a G20 parliamentary forum, which would bring in people who are in the national legislatures, which would also be a very, very important stimulus in terms of building deeper consensus on some of these issues, because these national assemblies or parliaments actually do represent or consist of people who are in their own right representing fairly large and substantial bodies of people. And so therefore, in addition to the Women's Forum, in addition to the Youth Forum, in addition to bringing other civil society groups, institutionally representative interaction in the G20 format, I think would enable or would help in broadening this template and bringing more and more stakeholders to bear in the process of trying to evolve a consensus on critical issues. With that, I'll have to take your leave because I am in the middle of an election and I still have 2 election meetings to finish, and it's 11:30 in the night. So, thank you very much. And I wish you all the best for your future deliberations. And I'm sorry that I'm being rude and I'll have to leave in this manner, but thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Manish. Have the best luck in your election.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Manish. All the best.
Thank you.
Maybe Ella, you wanted to add something to what Manish said, because you worked on accountability. So maybe the role of civil society has an importance in that.
Certainly, civil society does, and there's been engagement, as we've seen over the years, with a number of civil society actors that play, an important role in terms of agenda setting and putting forward ideas and thoughts. We see that more pervasively, I'd argue, in the G7 process, but it's also very much a factor in the G20 process through the Business 20 and the Civil 20 and the Youth 20, and they have analogous systems within the G7 process as well. But I would want to respond just to the question of accountability and implementation, because I thought that some really interesting points were raised by Pierre and Thomas. But I also wanted to add that, despite their informal nature and the lack of secretariat that was spoken of, I think the G7 and the G20 represent meetings of leaders who really want to govern effectively, but they understand that to govern effectively and to be seen as credible and legitimate, they have to work to forge consensus and to generate concrete and tangible commitments, not in all cases, but in many cases, against which they can be effectively evaluated and assessed. And of course, as Thomas very eloquently explained, there's not an official, scorecard against which to do so. But I would say that the G7, more so than the G20, I think has adopted a more robust accountability practice since launching their first official accountability report back in 2010. But these, of course, are effectively self-assessments, right? They're produced by the G7 countries themselves. And so there's a bit of a built-in bias, I'd say. But at the University of Toronto, we've been conducting our own accountability assessments, and these are independent assessments for over 25 years. And, we've seen certain trends in terms of leaders being able to garner more compliance and accountability when they link certain commitments like climate change with energy, or health with the economy, or finance with development, or when they repeat or reiterate certain commitments at subsequent summits that seems to have a positive effect on compliance, or when there's issue-specific ministerial meetings that take place, typically in the lead up to a G7 or a G20 meeting. This tends to also propel compliance in a positive way. Now, is this process perfect? Of course it isn't. These institutions are informal, like we talked about. Can they be improved? I'd say, of course, yes. But these are just some high-level observations that we've been able to make over the past few years when we dig in a bit deeper and try to understand how these accountability mechanisms work.
Thank you, Ella. I think we need to stop the discussion and open the floor to the audience for Q&As. I am going to add some people who have questions. So I'm going to add Paloma, who is going to be able to ask her question. And I'm going to add Marie. And also Juliette. Paloma, I invite you to ask your question. Paloma, are you able to unmute yourself? All right, we will try with someone else, maybe Marie Clouet. Are you able to talk?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Well, good evening. Thank you very much for asking me my question, and thank you very much for the speakers for this interesting discussion. I was actually wondering whether this multiplication of clubs, summits, and international agencies is not using too much of the state's resources, mainly financial one, but also in terms of time and energy. And also, if it does not contribute to make their roles and decision more difficult for the civil society, if it does not overlap too much and therefore make the visibility quite difficult for the civil society to understand what's happening and who is accountable precisely for what. Thank you.
Thank you, Marie. Juliette Leboda, would you like to ask your question?
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you all. So I was wondering about the topics of data because you addressed that topic earlier. I'm asking, for example, the OECD to contribute. Do you think that currently science is too much or too little a factor in decision making? What I mean by that is, do you think that we're using good data to take decision, or is it too maybe political or not enough? Should we take in account more cultures and society and cultural change and so on? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Juliette. Paloma, are you able to talk?
Yes, I just thought that you are not bothered by the sound. I'm so sorry. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Okay, so just my question was that you mentioned the growing impact of civil society and also businesses, and therefore I was wondering what you think is the role of the state in this growing multilateralism that includes a lot of private and other types of actors. And that was my question, and thank you for this presentation.
All right, I maybe repeat your question that you've written because I'm not sure we heard you very well. You asked regarding the growing role of civil society, regions, and businesses. Do you think that a multilateralism that focuses on states is obsolete? What is the role of states and therefore international organizations in our global issues? Thank you very much to you three.
Oh, Mathilde, we can't hear you. You're on mute. I'm sorry.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right. Thank you very much to the three of you. Maybe Jean-Pierre, you would like to react on one of the questions? We can't hear you, Jean-Pierre.
Okay, can you hear me now? It's okay. Okay, I think that the last question is for me very key because it's clear that whatever is the space of discussion, UN or G7, 20, etc. In general, governments have their own priorities, and these priorities very often are not to look for the best at the global level, but to look for the best at this state level or regional level, etc. So one question, for example, is to go from a formal decision taken by a group, G7, for example, or UN Conference of Parties, for example, to the implementation. And very often, when we are at this stage of implementing a decision, every government tries to find a way to not to fulfill completely what was the spirit of the decision. So the role of civil society for me is key if we want really to progress, and to progress at a pace compatible with the dimension of the big challenges we have to cope with. We will not be able to reach this result without a real pressure of civil society, and in particular of the young generation. So I think that any means to more involve the civil society into the process of decision, into the way to control more or less what are the actual behavior of the states, of the different actors in general, not only the states, but also the cities, the regions, the business, etc. That is absolutely critical if we want to really have a better world at the horizon of 2030, 2050. For me, this is a basic question.
Thank you. Cyrille, would you like to add something to the questions?
Yes, thank you. I agree with what has just been said. So just a few comments, just to say that first, in terms of modern diplomacy, of course, the state-centered diplomacy is not the only way to discuss about global affairs. And as you know, there are more and more in the international negotiations, this kind of multi-layer and multi-stakeholders approach, which brings together around states, businesses, cities, civil society, etc. So that's something which is fully integrated in the way we conduct the foreign policy right now. And just to give an example, as you know, events which were held by France recently, like the One Planet Summit or others, fully reflect this new approach, which is that we have not only to focus on public funds, public institutions, but also to involve all the stakeholders at a global level. So clearly it is included in the way we think about modern diplomacy. The second thing about Marie-Chloé's question about state resources and overlap in the system, she's right. I mean, Marie is right. There is probably too much complexity in the international system at the moment. When we see that it's very difficult to delete some organizations or to leave an organization, and that almost every year a new organization is created related to global issues. So we are in this world of hyper complexity, I would say, which and I share the view that for state resources, for the follow-up by civil society, it's more and more difficult to understand the efficiency of each organization, who has an impact, and there's a kind of competition among all these organizations. But at the same time, let me say that it's also very important not to freeze the system with the so-called traditional organizations, because we are also in a kind of Darwinian world where it's also, interesting to see that new initiatives challenge old organizations. And let me just take the example of health, global health. When the Global Fund Against AIDS, Tuberculosis, and Malaria was established, or when the Gavi, the Alliance for Vaccines, was established, it's precisely because at that time, the WHO was not seen as an organization which could deliver on the main challenges on health. So it's also interesting to see the evolution of the system, because it reflects also the way international organizations are perceived in terms of efficiency. And finally, on Juliette Lebauda's question, I'm not sure I got it precisely, but I understand that her question was about the relation between datas and cultures. Do we have only to rely on scientific datas? Of course, it's not government by scientists. It has to be clear. Science and data are one thing, political decision and democracy is another thing. But at the end, we have to have this link between a facts-based approach on global issues and also political perceptions, cultural approaches, and also the public opinions, which might or not think that these scientific data are relevant for political action. So it's a mix between the two, and it's where the democratic processes are extremely important. Is there a civil society that supports the scientific data? Are there criticisms or not? So it's this interaction between political debate on the priorities and what we know about science and data. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We will take another 3 questions. So let me add Alexiane, allowed to talk. Let me add Olivier. And Salomé Chevalier. Please, Alexiane.
Okay, good evening, everyone. I think that you can hear me. Yes. Thank you very much for these previous answers. I want to dig a bit deeper on the question of civil society. I would like to ask you how to better inform civil society about generally what the UN does, what are their objectives. For instance, I only learned about it only at university level and not before, not in high school. So how can we better educate even the youth about the UN, the G7, G20, or all of the other platforms? And then how can we better encourage also civil society's participations? Would you favor direct dialogues or other forms of participations? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alexiane. Olivier?
Yes, I have a question about the G20. So since the G20 is taking place this year in Indonesia, and that Indonesia is one of the countries most affected by climate change and had to move its capital as a consequence because Jakarta is currently sinking into the ground, do you think that climate change will be one of the main topics that will be discussed at the G20, in addition to also the problems of the displacement of populations due to extreme climatic events?
Thank you very much, Olivier. Salomé Chevalier?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, we do.
Yes, perfect. Thank you all. First, my question was about the measurement methods that we are using today, like the World Bank's method, like because they are based on monetary conception. most of the time. And regarding all the characteristic of today's issues like poverty or human rights, this is maybe you have maybe idea to improve these methods to in order to represent more and take into account more characteristic to really see the problems and all the elements of the problems. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Salome. Thomas, you would like to react on those questions?
Thank you, Mathilde. Well, before getting to this one, there is one thing I'd like to say to those young leaders who apply and being part of this G20, G7, UN ventures, and being part as civil society representatives to the international systems. There will be also something on your own shoulders to deal with this complexity issue that was the question of Marie, I guess, and also Paloma. Because the international system has been built for centuries on nations and nation states, which is political fiction, actually, that does encapsulate very complex sociological ingredients. And what Cyrille has presented as modern diplomacy, which is multi-layered and multi-stakeholder, is precisely to account for this complexity and to account for the fact that nation states are political fictions. I'm not saying they are not legitimate. I'm just saying that they are encapsulating much more that needs to be at the table. Leaders from the business, leaders from local governments, etc., etc. At the end of the day, what makes a huge difference when it comes to diplomatic decision, whether it's the G20, G7, the UN, whatever, it's the way that this complexity, the shape of the forum that in which the discussion takes place, it can deliver leadership. And I did appreciate the fact that Cyrille precisely said that the difference between the UN and the G20, for example, is that on the one side there is a secretariat and no leaders, and on the other side there are leaders and no secretariat. That's a quick but very good summarizing of the main difference. And we could zoom on what's on the difference it makes in dealing with this complexity. Look at, for example, when we signed up for the UN Charter in 1945, obviously the most important issue was to deal with security issues. And that's why the UN Security Council is probably the overarching decision body in the UN system. But there was already a good notion of the fact that economic and social issues would be part of international relations themselves. And that was not only linked to the Bretton Woods institution's creation, it was also laid out in the creation of the Social and Economic Council of the UN. But look at the way the Social and Economic Council works. It cannot solve any crisis because it's not with leadership. We have a social economic forum that does exist in the UN, but it's not based on leadership and political leadership that accounts for the complexity of different layers and stakeholders that a democratic leader or a national leader has to account for. So in dealing with the complexity of the international system, we are still based on the political fiction of nation states. And I'm not saying the nation states are illegitimate, but it prevents us from addressing some loopholes in global governance. And that's why I wanted to address, to shed light on one key example. For example, if we look at tech issues, we know that some tech companies are much more powerful than many countries, many states, many nation states. If you look at Google, the market capitalization of Google, the investment capabilities of Google, it could account for many different African countries and probably some of the G20 countries itself. And its innovation capabilities are critical too. So how could you deal with regulation of consent online? How can you ensure ethics in artificial intelligence? How can you address democratic functioning of online public space if you don't integrate such stakeholders like GAFAM, for example, in the loop? So that brings us back to the leadership question and to the complexity of the international systems. And what I wanted to say to those who apply for the process is that there is one tendency in France that I see every year from a year to another in recruiting processes for the Y20, Y7 applications, is that many young leaders who apply for this process say, well, this is a problem, we should create an organization to solve that problem. And there is one tendency in our approach as young leaders to say, well, let's fix it with an organization. And there you come back to what Cyrille has said. There is organizations created every year. Creating an organization is probably creating new problems and not creating solutions to address the issues we want to solve. And that's what I wanted to highlight in speaking about leadership. It's about somehow, and G20 did that, for example, in having all engagement groups around its presidency. It's about bringing all relevant actors at all relevant layers to address one specific issue. And there is this French paradox that we generally tend to say, let's create a new organization that will be a solution to that problem. But on the other side, it's the French diplomacy that has been the most creative over the past few years to provide with another approach to this global governance loopholes. And therefore, I'd like to mention one thing that is key. The French diplomacy has created the Paris Peace Forum in 2018, which is supposed to be, I'm not sure they have achieved to get to that point, but it's interesting to highlight the intention of the forum. And it's a forum, it's not an organization, an international organization. Their intention was to create a sort of incubator of projects to address global governance loopholes in the systems. And in bringing states, universities, NGOs, firms, academia, national and subnational leaders around the same table to address very specific issues. I would like to take one example to wrap up. I mentioned tech issues earlier on. If you look at the way that we have tried to address the fact that there is no human rights convention to avoid, just like we did with the Geneva Convention, civil society casualties in the cyberspace. In 2018, the Paris Peace Forum brought leaders around the same table with Microsoft, for example, to launch the Paris Call for Trust in the Cyberspace, Trust and Security in the Cyberspace. And this has been a growing initiative with many different nation states, tech companies from different sides and sizes. And therefore you have a new format of coalition. And now we have different points on the map, on the international map. We have international organizations, formal organizations like the UN systems. We have leadership groups, and there are coalitions which bring together different types of actors. And I guess that modern diplomacy will be increasingly complex because we have to face increasingly complex issues. But it's in dealing with those three types of groups, formal groups, leadership groups, and multi-stakeholder groups that we will achieve solving global issues.
Thank you very much, Thomas, for these explanations. Unless one of the panelists would like to add something, it's 7:30, so we are coming to the end of this conference.
Just
Yes,
make one comment as well.
May I just add a very short word on one question, maybe on Olivier's question. I think Olivier's question was on the climate change and the displacement of populations. Will it be on the agenda on the by Indonesia? I think this question is very important because my feeling is that this issue of environment and climate change will remain on the agenda for years. That's absolutely clear. And that probably the G20 and the G7 will change in the future the way they deal with this issue. Because when you look at the main conclusions of G7 and G20 summits most of the time they take stake of the latest COP, or they prepare the next COP with the same issues like what will we have ambitious NDCs, what will be the level of reduction of our emissions. So that's a traditional agenda. I think that in the future, my feeling is that these clubs will concentrate more and more on, I would say, a consistency of the tools they use at transnational level to fight against climate change. That means that we will go from a kind of abstract discussion on climate change to more and more concrete tools and more on the issue of consistency. Discussions on taxation, discussions on subsidies, discussions of regulations, discussion on trades, on tariff duties, all these issues, when we will go closer and closer to the big issues and when facing the challenge of climate change, the more we will go into the detail of coordinating our economic tools, not only at national level, but to coordinate the kind of industrial standards on cars, on housing, on many things. And so that's my feeling, is that Olivier's question is not only about this year, it's the way this agenda will evolve and the way, in terms of methods, the G20 will be more proactive and more efficient. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Cyrille. Ella, you wanted to add something.
I really wanted to also comment on the question of climate, because I think it's absolutely critical. And we see a certain cadence every year that starts with the G7 process early in the spring, and then moves into the fall sessions of the United Nations and the General Assembly meetings. And then we move into the G20 meetings, and then, finally COP. And that, repeats itself year after year. But the G20 in a large, to a large extent, also sets the foundation for what's eventually going to be discussed and dealt with at the COP meeting, I think. And this, I think for Indonesia, it's not going to be any different. I agree with you, Cyrille, 100% that the G7 and the G20 have been tackling climate change issues. The G7 actually since 1979 was their first reference to emissions. The G20, I'd say, in the last decade. And so it's more now a question of mainstreaming climate within their discussions. It's not just a communique paragraph or a sentence or two on climate change. It's ensuring that climate change is part of the vernacular throughout these final declarations and these communiques, that they're linked to debt issues and finance issues and tech issues and transport issues and biodiversity issues. That climate really becomes the focal point when reaching consensus agreement on a number of international agreements. So there's absolutely no way in backtracking. Climate is here to stay, and it's going to permeate, I think, every aspect of these conversations moving forward.
Thank you very much, Ella, and thank you to all our panelists for being there today and to answer all these interesting questions from the audience. Sorry also to all the attendees because we weren't able to take all questions. So sorry for that. And I let the floor to Jean-Baptiste Boisson, who is going to tell us more about the selection process. And then I think we can close the conference. Is that right?
Yes, thank you, Mathilde. So maybe to be quick, normally all the pre-selected candidates that will attend the interviews on Saturday will have received by now an email. So I invite you all to check your email boxes if you've received this information. I would like to thank all the candidates because, as I mentioned in the beginning, all your proposals were particularly enlightening and insightful, and we read them with a lot of intention and we were very happy to see the broad topics that were raised. So thank you for that. And I would eventually like to thank all the panelists as well as Mathilde said for the tonight conferences. Thank you.